On our anniversary, I held out the small box with both hands, the way you do when something matters more than it looks. The wrapping was plain, the ribbon thin, my fingers still warm from the drive home. He stared at it longer than I expected, his eyebrows lifting as if he were waiting for a punchline. "What is this?" he said, laughing once under his breath. "A gift?" Before I could answer, before I could explain anything at all, he tossed it aside. He didn't even stand up. The box skidded across the floor and bumped softly against the leg of the table, the sound smaller than it should have been, like a thought dismissed too quickly. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice or ask him why. I didn't reach for the box right away either. I sat there for a second longer than felt natural, staring at the empty space between us, at the way he had already turned back to his plate as if the moment were finished. When I finally leaned down and picked it up, I did it carefully. I set it beside my chair and smoothed the ribbon back into place. He didn't notice. Or he did, and chose not to. That night, nothing exploded. There was no dramatic silence, no slammed doors. We finished dinner. We talked about work and schedules and things that didn't matter. And as I listened to him speak, I realized this wasn't about one careless moment. It was about how easily months of my life had just been reduced to nothing. The house looked the same as it always did, warm light spilling across familiar walls. The table set the way I'd learned he liked it. I had planned the evening with the same quiet attention I brought to everything else in our marriage. The meal, the timing, even the music playing low in the background had been chosen to fit him. That part of me was practiced, efficient. I knew how to make things comfortable. What I hadn't expected was how little the night seemed to mean to him. He ate without hurry, without curiosity. He talked as if the calendar hadn't marked anything special at all. When I watched him, I felt something settle into place inside me, a clarity I hadn't allowed before. He didn't apologize. He didn't circle back to the box. He acted as if nothing worth discussing had happened. And I understood then that this wasn't forgetfulness. It was certainty. He was certain the moment didn't deserve more space than he'd given it. It wasn't the first time my work had been treated that way. Over the years, the things I made with my hands had been called a hobby, something I did to pass time, something harmless and unimportant. He said it with a smile, always, as if that made it kind. He praised effort when it came with a visible paycheck, when success had a number attached to it. What I did, the long hours alone, the precision, the patience, were invisible to him because he had never needed to see them. I learned to let comments slide. I learned not to correct him when he joked about my work to friends or when someone else laughed along. I learned how to keep the peace by making myself smaller, quieter, easier to live with. At some point, silence became less about patience and more about survival. That night, though, something shifted. As we cleared the table, I felt the weight of that small box in my awareness, even where it sat untouched beside me. It wasn't anger that rose up. It was recognition. I saw the pattern clearly, from the first offhand remark years ago to the casual way he had tossed the box aside without a second thought. When he went to bed, he did it without hesitation, already half asleep before his head hit the pillow. I stayed in the living room with the lights low, the house settling around me. I picked up the box again and turned it over in my hands. It held the proof of time spent, decisions made, mistakes corrected, and hours I would never get back. Holding it, I felt steadier than I had all evening. I thought about waking him, about explaining, about forcing the conversation we had avoided for so long. I imagined his response, the familiar blend of dismissal and reassurance, the way he would tell me I was being sensitive, that he hadn't meant it that way. None of those imagined endings led anywhere new. So I didn't say a word. I placed the box somewhere he wouldn't see it and turned off the lights. As I stood in the quiet, I understood that choosing not to speak wasn't surrender. It was control. For the first time in a long while, I felt awake, fully present in my own life. That was the moment I stopped trying to be seen by someone who had already decided not to look. I woke before him the next morning, the house still wrapped in that thin, early light that makes everything feel undecided. For a few seconds, I forgot what day it was. Then I remembered the box, the sound it made against the table leg, the way he'd laughed as if I'd offered him a joke instead of something real. He came into the kitchen while I was making coffee, already dressed, already moving on. He kissed my cheek out of habit, reached for a mug, asked if I'd seen his keys. There was no pause, no glance toward the living room, no acknowledgement of the night before. It wasn't awkward. That was the part that settled uncomfortably in my chest. He wasn't avoiding the subject. He had already decided it didn't exist. I answered him, handed him the mug, watched him leave. The door closed behind him with the same soft click it always made. When the house went quiet again, I stood there longer than necessary, staring at the counter, realizing how quickly disrespect becomes routine when no one challenges it. For years, my work had lived in that space between tolerated and dismissed. He called it a hobby, always with a smile, as if the word softened the insult. Something you do to relax, he'd say, something that keeps you busy. He never said it was worthless. He didn't have to. The way he spoke about it did that work for him. What he respected were things that announced their value loudly. Titles, promotions, numbers you could point to. When someone mentioned a raise or a bonus, his attention sharpened. When the subject turned to what I made, he drifted, checked his phone, nodded politely. Over time, I learned the rhythm of it. Praise for effort was conditional. Respect came with a price tag. I told myself it didn't matter, that not everything needed his approval, that I knew what my work meant. But slowly, without noticing, I stopped talking about it. I stopped correcting him when he joked about it in front of friends. I stopped sharing details because it was easier than watching his eyes glaze over. Silence became a skill, one I practiced well. At dinners with friends, someone would ask what I did, and before I could answer, he'd jump in. "She makes things," he'd say, laughing lightly, with her hands. "It's more for fun than anything serious." People would smile, nod, move on. I'd smile too, my mouth trained into cooperation. It felt harmless in the moment. Later, it felt like erosion. His family followed his lead. Questions about his work were specific, interested. Questions about mine were vague, polite, quickly exhausted. I learned to keep my responses short. I learned how to deflect. I learned that being agreeable was rewarded with peace, and pushing back only created tension I was expected to resolve. The worst part was how normal it all became. There was no single argument I could point to, no dramatic dismissal that would justify anger. It was 1,000 small moments, layered quietly on top of each other. Jokes, assumptions. The way he'd praise me for being supportive, for being understanding, for not making a big deal out of things. As if my ability to disappear gracefully were a virtue. Standing alone in the kitchen that morning, I realized how much I had participated in my own shrinking. Not because I believed him exactly, but because I believed peace was worth the cost. I believed that harmony required compromise, and compromise meant letting some things go unnamed. I carried my coffee into the living room and sat where the box had landed the night before. The carpet showed no sign of it now. Everything had returned to its place just like he had. I thought about how easily he'd dismissed something that had taken me months, how little curiosity he'd shown. It wasn't that he didn't understand. It was that he didn't need to. That understanding brought a strange calm with it. Not relief, not anger, but clarity. I saw the pattern as a whole for the first time, from the early days when he'd laughed off my work as a phase, to the steady certainty he carried now. He didn't fail to see my value. He chose not to look for it. I thought about all the times I'd adjusted myself to fit the shape he expected, all the conversations I'd avoided, all the explanations I'd rehearsed and then swallowed. There was a quiet grief in realizing how much of myself I'd edited for the sake of being easy to live with. The box sat where I'd placed it, out of sight, untouched. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. Holding it the night before had already told me what I needed to know. I wasn't angry at him. I was disappointed in the version of myself that had believed this was the best I could expect. By the time the coffee had gone cold, the thought had settled fully in my mind. Staying silent again would mean agreeing with him, It would mean confirming that my work, my time, my effort were optional things, valuable only when someone else decided they were. I rinsed the mug and set it in the sink. The house felt different now. Not hostile, not unsafe, just wrong in a way I could finally name. I wasn't ready to speak yet, but I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that I wouldn't keep swallowing this moment the way I had all the others. Whatever I did next, it wouldn't be about proving anything to him. It would be about stopping the slow, quiet habit of disappearing. He fell asleep quickly that night, the way people do when they believe nothing important is unsettled. I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar rhythm of his breathing. The house was quiet, not tense, not heavy. That was what made it different. For the first time, the silence didn't feel like something I had to fix. I got out of bed without waking him. The floor was cool under my feet as I moved through the dark, every step deliberate. I didn't turn on the lights. I didn't need to. I knew this house well enough to navigate it half asleep, which made it easier to notice how little it felt like mine. I picked up the box where I had hidden it earlier and held it in my hands again. It was heavier than it looked, not just in weight but in what it carried. Months of work, dozens of decisions only I remembered making, tiny corrections no one had ever seen. I turned it over slowly, my thumb tracing the edge of the lid, feeling a steadiness settle in my chest. The hurt from the night before was still there, but it had changed shape. It wasn't sharp anymore. It had flattened into something clearer, something I could look at without flinching. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a bad moment or an awkward joke gone wrong. It was consistent. It made sense once I stopped trying to excuse it. I thought about waking him, about sitting on the edge of the bed and explaining carefully why what he'd done mattered. I imagined the look he'd give me, half confused, half annoyed. I imagined the familiar phrases, "You're taking this too seriously." "You know I didn't mean it like that. You always overthink things." I'd heard them often enough to know where they led, nowhere new. I realized then that confrontation would only put me back in the same position, asking to be understood by someone who had already decided what I was worth. Silence, in that moment, felt less like avoidance and more like clarity. I didn't owe him another explanation. I owed myself honesty. I moved through the living room, gathering only what I needed. My bag, my keys, the box. Nothing that would be missed right away, nothing that would raise questions if he noticed later. I left everything else where it was. The couch cushions straight, the kitchen counters clean, no signs of disruption, no clues. It struck me how practiced I was at this kind of carefulness. How many times I had moved quietly around his moods, his expectations, his assumptions. The difference now was that I wasn't trying to keep the peace. I was buying myself time. When I stepped outside, the night air felt sharper, colder than I expected. The street was empty, the houses dark and closed in on themselves. I locked the door behind me and paused for a second, my hand resting on the knob. There was no dramatic rush of emotion, no fear strong enough to stop me. Just a sense that I was crossing a line I wouldn't cross back over. The car started on the first turn of the key. I placed the box on the passenger seat and buckled it in, the motion automatic, almost absurdly careful. As I pulled away from the house, I didn't look back. I focused on the road ahead, the glow of the dashboard, the quiet hum of the engine. I had driven past the gallery countless times before. It sat on a corner I usually avoided, its windows bright and confident, its doors closed in a way that felt intentional rather than unwelcoming. I'd told myself it wasn't for people like me, that my work wasn't finished enough, refined enough, worthy of that kind of space. The idea had lodged itself deep enough that I stopped questioning it. Now, as I drove toward it, I felt a flicker of fear I couldn't quite name. Not fear of rejection. That had already happened in my own living room. This felt different. This was the fear of confirmation, of finding out, once and for all, whether I had been right to doubt myself. I slowed as I approached the street, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. The gallery lights were still on, casting long rectangles onto the sidewalk. I parked across the street and sat there with the engine running, watching the entrance. I could still turn around. I could still go home, slide back into bed, let the night dissolve into morning as if nothing had changed. The thought lasted only a moment. Home no longer felt like a neutral place. It felt like a space that required me to pretend, to explain, to make myself smaller than I was. Sitting there in the car, I understood that whatever waited behind those glass doors carried less risk than staying where I was unseen. I turned off the engine and picked up the box. It rested solidly in my hands, grounding me. I took a breath, then another, feeling my heartbeat slow. This wasn't a dramatic escape. It was a decision, quiet and precise, like so many of the choices I'd made while working alone. As I stepped out of the car, the night felt wider, full of possibility and uncertainty in equal measure. I crossed the street and stood on the sidewalk, the gallery just a few steps away. The door reflected my image back at me, smaller than I felt inside. I didn't know what would happen once I walked in. I didn't know if anyone would see what I saw, or if I'd be turned away with polite disinterest. What I did know was that I couldn't unknow what I'd realized in the dark of my own house. I reached for the handle, the box steady against my side, and understood that this was the moment everything shifted. Once I opened that door, nothing would fit back into the life I'd been quietly enduring. The door opened with a soft chime, and for a moment I stood there unsure of where to put my eyes. The space was brighter than I expected, the light clean and intentional, nothing like the dim, cautious places I'd imagined. White walls, polished floors, pieces spaced far enough apart that each one seemed to breathe on its own. A woman looked up from behind a narrow desk near the back. She didn't rush toward me or glance immediately at what I was holding. She simply met my eyes and waited, which unsettled me more than judgment would have. I took a step inside and let the door close behind me. "I'm sorry," I said automatically, the old reflex rising. "I know it's late." She smiled, not indulgent, not dismissive. "We're still open," she said. "Take your time." I nodded and moved farther in, my footsteps echoing softly. I hadn't planned what I would say. I hadn't rehearsed an explanation. All I had was the box and the quiet resolve that had carried me this far. I held it against my chest, suddenly aware of how small it looked in this open space. I stopped in front of the nearest piece, not because it drew me in, but because I needed a reason to stand still. I studied the lines, the texture, the confidence of it. Whoever had made it hadn't apologized for its existence. That realization stung more than I expected. "Is that yours?" the woman asked gently. I turned. She was standing a few feet away now, close enough to speak without raising her voice, far enough not to crowd me. Her eyes were on the box, curious but patient. "Yes," I said. The word felt heavier than it should have. "I mean, I made it." "Would you like to show me?" she asked. There was no hint of skepticism in her tone, no pressure, just an invitation. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the lid and revealed what was inside. I waited for the familiar flicker of dismissal, the polite smile that signaled the end of the conversation. It didn't come. She leaned in, slowly, as if approaching something fragile. She didn't touch it right away. She studied it from different angles, her head tilting, her expression thoughtful. The seconds stretched, long enough that my chest began to ache with the effort of not filling the silence. "How long did this take you?" she asked. I blinked. No one had ever asked me that before. Not really. "A few months," I said, "on and off, mostly nights." "And the material?" she continued. I answered. Then another question followed. Then another. Technique. Process. Choices I'd made along the way. Mistakes I'd corrected. As I spoke, something unexpected happened. My voice steadied. The words came more easily than I thought they would. I wasn't defending myself. I was explaining. She listened without interrupting, her attention focused in a way I wasn't used to. When she finally reached out and touched the piece, she did it carefully, as if she understood the weight of the time it carried. "This is very precise work," she said. "You know that, right?" I nodded, though the truth was I wasn't sure I did, not in the way she meant it. She asked where I had studied, who I had shown my work to, where I had exhibited before. Each question felt like stepping into unfamiliar territory. I answered honestly. Nowhere, no one. I worked at home, mostly alone. She smiled again, but this time there was something sharper behind it. Recognition, maybe, or possibility. You didn't come here by accident, she said. The comment startled me. I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that I hadn't planned anything, that this was impulsive and messy and unprepared. But the words didn't come. She was right. I hadn't come by accident. I had come because staying where I was felt impossible. She asked if she could show it to someone else. Another woman joined us, then a man. They spoke quietly among themselves, using words I wasn't sure belonged to me. Balance, intention, discipline. I stood to the side, my hands clasped together, my heart beating louder with every sentence. No one laughed. No one glanced at the clock. No one asked what it was worth in the way I'd grown used to hearing. They asked what it meant, how it held together, why I'd chosen certain paths over others. The questions felt like doors opening, one after another. Finally, the first woman turned back to me. "Would you be open to leaving this with us?" she asked. "Just for a short time." I hesitated. The instinct to pull back flared, sharp and sudden. This was the thing he had thrown aside without a second thought. Letting it out of my hands felt risky in a way I couldn't fully articulate. "For evaluation," she added, as if sensing my hesitation. "No promises, but I'd like to look at it more closely." I took a breath. This was the moment, I realized, where I usually stepped back. Where I said, maybe later, or I'll think about it, or thank you, but no. The moment where I protected myself from disappointment by avoiding possibility. "Yes," I said instead, "I'm open to that." She nodded, satisfied, and led me to the desk to take my information. As I wrote my name, my hand steadied. The letters looked different on the page, more solid somehow. When I stepped back out into the night, my hands were empty. The car felt quieter without the box beside me. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment before starting the engine, my thoughts tumbling forward instead of back. I didn't know what would come of it. I didn't know if I would hear from them again, or if this would dissolve into another polite rejection. What I did know was that for the first time, someone had looked at what I made and seen it without needing to be convinced. As I drove home, the house no longer felt like the center of my world. It felt like one place among many, no longer the only space where my life unfolded. And somewhere between the gallery lights fading behind me and the dark road ahead, I understood that something fundamental had shifted. Not because I had been chosen, but because I had finally chosen myself. The house was quiet when I got back, the kind of quiet that feels staged, as if it's waiting for someone to break it. He was asleep, sprawled comfortably across his side of the bed, unaware of the space I'd crossed without him. I stood in the doorway for a moment, listening, letting the familiar scene register without stepping into it. I lay down beside him and stared at the ceiling again, but it didn't feel the same as before. My hands were empty now, and that absence carried a strange relief. The box wasn't hidden in the house anymore. It wasn't waiting to be dismissed again. It was somewhere else, under different lights, in the hands of people who had asked questions instead of laughing. The next morning followed the same rhythm as always. Coffee, keys, a quick kiss on the cheek. He mentioned a meeting he was stressed about, complained about traffic, asked what was for dinner. He didn't ask about the night before. He didn't ask where I'd gone after he fell asleep. I realized he assumed I had stayed exactly where he left me. I answered him the way I always did, nodding, making space for his concerns. But something inside me stayed quiet and alert, like a door left slightly open. When he left, I didn't feel the usual sense of collapse. I felt watchful. The call came later that afternoon while I was working at the table by the window. I almost didn't answer it. Unknown numbers had become easy to ignore, but something told me not to. I wiped my hands on a cloth and picked up the phone. She introduced herself, her voice measured and calm. She thanked me for coming in, for trusting them with my work. She said they had spent the morning looking closely at it. Really looking. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the familiar pivot toward polite disappointment. Instead, she told me they were impressed. Not vaguely, not conditionally. She spoke about technique, about intention, about how rarely they saw that level of patience in newer artists. She asked if I would be open to discussing next steps: representation, placement, possibility. I sat down slowly, the chair creaking under my weight. My mind struggled to keep up with her words. I asked questions to ground myself, to make sure I wasn't misunderstanding. She answered each one without hesitation. Nothing about the conversation felt rushed, nothing felt like flattery. When the call ended, I sat there for a long time with the phone still in my hand. The house felt different again. Not smaller, not larger, just slightly misaligned with the person I was becoming. I thought about telling him. The idea rose automatically, as if that was the natural next step. Share the news. Let him know. Invite him into the moment. Then I imagined his reaction. The raised eyebrows, the sudden interest, the way his tone would shift, curious now that there was something tangible to attach to it. He would ask what it meant financially, how serious it was, whether it was worth pursuing. The questions would come fast and they would all orbit the same center. I didn't want that moment shaped by his language. So I said nothing. Over the next few days, the calls and emails continued. Details followed, timelines, logistics. I learned to read messages carefully, to respond without minimizing myself. Each exchange felt like practice, like strengthening a muscle I hadn't known I was allowed to use. At home, nothing changed on the surface. We ate dinner together. We talked about errands and plans and other people's lives. He remained comfortably unaware, his world intact. I watched him from a distance that grew slightly wider each day, noticing things I'd overlooked before. How often he assumed agreement. How rarely he asked questions unless they benefited him. The more my other life expanded, the clearer the contrast became. In one space I was listened to, in the other I was tolerated. The difference wasn't dramatic, but it was undeniable. One evening he joked about my work again, the same old line delivered casually, without malice. I smiled the way I always had, but this time it felt deliberate, controlled. I understood the power of withholding. He didn't need to know yet, not because I was afraid, but because the moment wasn't his. Lying in bed that night, I stared into the dark and thought about timing, about how often I'd rushed to explain myself in the past, desperate to be understood. Now understanding was coming from somewhere else, and it didn't demand urgency. I realized that silence could be strategic, that keeping something to myself didn't mean it was fragile, it meant it was mine. As I drifted toward sleep, a new awareness settled over me. Whatever happened next, whatever decisions I made, I would no longer measure their worth by his reaction. The center of gravity had shifted, quietly but decisively. And for the first time since our anniversary, I felt something close to anticipation. Not for his approval, but for what would happen when the truth finally stood on its own, without needing to be defended. The invitation arrived in my inbox on a Tuesday morning, brief and precise, the kind of message that assumes you understand the weight of what's being offered. A private viewing, a small group, a date already circled on someone else's calendar. I read it twice, then once more, not because I didn't understand it, but because I needed to feel how calmly it landed in my body. I forwarded it to myself, then closed the laptop and went about my day as if nothing had changed. That was becoming a pattern. Big moments arriving quietly, settling into place without asking permission. I found myself enjoying the discipline of it, the way restraint sharpened my focus instead of dulling it. At home, the shift didn't go unnoticed forever. He started asking questions that skimmed the surface, casual enough to sound uninterested, pointed enough to gather information. Who had called earlier? Why I was out late again? Whether I was working on something new? I answered truthfully without elaborating, a skill I had perfected over years of being selectively transparent. He noticed the difference in me before he understood it. The way I moved through rooms without checking his face first. The way my attention stayed with my own thoughts a second longer than before. Confidence, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It changes the temperature of a space. One evening he mentioned the gallery in passing, said he'd walked by it on his way to meet a client, said it looked busy. The comment hung there, waiting for me to attach something to it. I didn't. I nodded and changed the subject. The silence stretched, unfamiliar now that I wasn't filling it for him. "What have you been working on exactly?" he asked later, trying again. "Things," I said. It wasn't evasive, it was accurate. He frowned, not angry, just unsettled. I recognized the expression. It was the look he wore when control slipped slightly out of reach, when the script he relied on didn't quite fit the scene. I felt a flicker of something then. Not satisfaction, but confirmation. This was what it looked like when assumptions cracked. The days leading up to the viewing passed quickly. Meetings filled my schedule, conversations that required preparation and precision. I learned to speak about my work without apology, to answer questions directly, to say no when something didn't align. Each choice reinforced the last, building a structure I could stand inside. The night of the viewing, I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to reflect where I was. The mirror showed me a version of myself I hadn't fully met yet. Someone steadier, someone less inclined to explain. I left the house without announcing where I was going, and he didn't ask. The gap between us widened quietly, like a crack forming under steady pressure. The gallery was different this time. Softer lighting, familiar faces, people who greeted me by name. My piece stood where it belonged, no longer tentative, no longer hidden. I watched others approach it, lean in, ask questions. I listened as they spoke about it with respect, with curiosity. No one laughed, no one dismissed it as a hobby. I didn't search the room for validation. I didn't need to. The recognition was already embedded in the way the evening unfolded, in the conversations that carried forward without me pushing them. When someone asked about availability, about next steps, I answered calmly, my voice steady. Later, as the night wound down, I stepped outside for air. The city hummed around me, indifferent and alive. I checked my phone and saw a missed call from him. No message, just the notification. I slid the phone back into my pocket and stood there a moment longer, letting the cool settle my thoughts. When I got home, he was awake, sitting on the couch with the television on mute. He looked up as I entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Where were you?" he asked. "At a viewing," I said. He waited for more. I didn't offer it. He nodded slowly, processing. "You could have told me." I met his eyes, really met them, and saw the expectation there. The assumption that I owed him context, inclusion, reassurance. I felt no urge to satisfy it. "I didn't need to," I said. The silence that followed was different from all the others we'd shared. It wasn't something I smoothed over. It wasn't something I fixed. It simply existed, heavy with everything unspoken. That night, lying in bed, I understood that visibility changes dynamics whether you acknowledge it or not. Being seen elsewhere had altered the balance here, and there was no returning to the version of myself that accepted being overlooked. The stakes were higher now, not because of what I stood to gain, but because of what I refused to lose. Whatever came next would demand a decision, not just from me, but from the life I had been living. And for the first time, I was ready to let that life answer for itself. The shift didn't announce itself with an argument or a confession. It showed up in smaller ways, the kind you notice only after they've happened enough times to form a pattern. He started watching me more closely, his questions sharper, his tone edged with something that felt like calculation. At dinner one night, he asked how much time I was spending on my work now. Not out of curiosity, but inventory, as if he were measuring something that belonged to him and finding the numbers unfamiliar. I answered honestly, and he frowned, pushing food around his plate as if it no longer tasted the same. "You know," he said, casual on the surface, "it might be time to think about what's practical." I looked at him, really looked, and saw the assumption underneath. That practicality was his domain. That ambition was acceptable only when it followed the shape he approved of. I didn't argue. I nodded once and let the comment fall where it landed. A few days later, he mentioned money. Not directly, not crudely, but with the confidence of someone used to controlling the narrative. He talked about budgets, about future plans, about the importance of stability. He spoke as if my work were a variable to be managed, something that could be adjusted or minimized to keep things predictable. I listened, recognizing the familiar rhythm. This was how he reasserted control when uncertainty crept in, by reframing it as responsibility, by positioning himself as the voice of reason. I had played along with this script for years, mistaking dominance for care. The calls from the gallery continued. Offers began to solidify. Conversations shifted from interest to intent. I learned how quickly respect changes the way people speak to you, how differently questions are framed when your time is considered valuable. At home, that difference became impossible to ignore. He asked more pointed questions now, about who I was meeting, about what exactly was being discussed. His tone carried a new sharpness, as if he were afraid of missing something crucial. One evening he laughed it off, saying, "I didn't know you were this serious about it." The comment landed hard, not because it was cruel, but because it revealed everything. He hadn't known, because he hadn't wanted to. My seriousness had existed all along. It just hadn't served him to recognize it. I began to see how often he reframed my growth as inconvenience. Late nights became selfishness. Focus became obsession. Independence became distance. The language shifted subtly, turning progress into a problem that needed solving. He suggested I slow down, take a break, remember what mattered. The implication was clear. What mattered was the version of me that fit neatly into his life. I realized then that this wasn't about jealousy. It was about power, about losing the advantage that came from being unquestioned. My success wasn't threatening because it changed my schedule. It was threatening because it changed the balance. The confrontation came quietly, on an ordinary afternoon. He asked me directly this time why I hadn't told him more about what was happening. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something brittle underneath it. "I didn't think you were interested," I said. He scoffed, offended. "Of course I'm interested, we're married." The word hung between us, heavier than it ever had. I understood then how differently we defined it. To him, marriage meant access. It meant being informed, included, centered. To me, it had begun to mean something else entirely. "I'm interested now," he added as if that settled it. I felt a strange calm wash over me. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. His interest had arrived late, summoned by external validation, not respect. It wasn't curiosity. It was ownership trying to reassert itself. "I don't need permission," I said softly. He stared at me, the silence stretching long enough to become uncomfortable. I could see him recalibrating, searching for the right response, the right leverage. This was new territory for both of us. He tried again, this time with warmth. He talked about partnership, about being a team. He said he just wanted to understand. The words sounded reasonable. They always had. But now I could hear what they were built on. Understanding to him meant influence. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of anything. I simply didn't retreat. I held my ground, answering only what I chose to answer, offering nothing extra. The effect was immediate. He grew restless, unsettled by the absence of the version of me he knew how to navigate. That night, as we moved around each other in the house, I understood something essential. The conflict wasn't new. It had always been there, woven into the way we spoke, the way decisions were made. The difference was that I was no longer smoothing it over. My success had exposed a truth we'd both avoided. He valued me most when I was manageable. When I stopped being that, he didn't know where to place me. Lying in bed, I stared into the dark and felt the weight of the choice ahead. This wasn't about proving myself. It wasn't about winning. It was about whether I was willing to return to a life built on being underestimated. For the first time, I knew the answer before the question finished forming. The offer arrived sooner than I expected, formal and unmistakable, its language precise in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. I read it slowly, then again, absorbing the certainty of it. This wasn't interest or possibility anymore. It was commitment, outlined in clean lines and clear terms. I didn't rush to answer. I set the message aside and finished what I was doing, letting the moment settle instead of surge. That restraint felt earned. I had learned that urgency often belonged to people who needed something confirmed. I didn't. What I needed was alignment. When we spoke later that day, the conversation was measured, professional. I asked questions I wouldn't have known how to ask months earlier. About timing, about representation, about what would happen if circumstances changed. Each answer came without condescension, without surprise. I was being met where I stood. I hung up and sat quietly for a while, listening to the house breathe around me. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable, the way the right choice does when you've already made it in smaller ways 100 times before. I drafted my response, reviewed it once, and sent it. The relief that followed wasn't excitement. It was steadiness. At home, the atmosphere shifted almost immediately, as if something had registered without being spoken aloud. He sensed it before he knew it. The questions came sharper now, more insistent, circling the edges of what he didn't yet have access to. "What exactly are they offering?" he asked that evening, trying to sound casual. I told him enough to be truthful, and no more. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in calculation. I watched the moment when curiosity turned into concern, when my certainty unsettled him. "That sounds serious," he said. "We should talk about it." The word should carried weight. It always had. It was his way of setting a direction without asking if I agreed. I nodded once, not in compliance but acknowledgement. The difference mattered to me. When we did talk, it wasn't the conversation he expected. He framed his concerns carefully, speaking about risk and stability, about how things might look if I took on too much. He spoke as if he were protecting us, as if caution were a shared language. I listened, then told him what I had decided. The silence that followed stretched thin. He tried to mask his reaction, but I could see it flicker across his face. Surprise, then frustration, then something close to disbelief. He asked when I had decided, and I told him the truth. Not all at once, over time. "You didn't include me," he said finally. I met his eyes and felt no urge to defend myself. "I didn't exclude you," I said. "I made a decision." He leaned back, crossing his arms, recalibrating. This was the point where he usually shifted tactics, where warmth followed pressure. He spoke about partnership again, about how decisions should be shared. The words sounded practiced, familiar. They had once worked. "I'm not asking for permission," I said quietly. "I'm informing you." The difference landed between us with a weight neither of us could ignore. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with the realization that something fundamental had changed. The leverage he relied on no longer applied. That night, he moved through the house restlessly, opening and closing doors, starting conversations he didn't finish. I watched from a distance, aware of the widening space between us. This wasn't a fight. It was a reckoning. Later, alone in the bedroom, I thought about how often I had waited for approval before moving forward. How many opportunities I'd reshaped to fit someone else's comfort. Signing the agreement hadn't just formalized my work, it had formalized my independence. The next day brought confirmations, dates, arrangements, the quiet hum of progress. Each email reinforced the reality of what I had chosen. I felt grounded, purposeful, unburdened by the need to justify myself. At home, the tension settled into something brittle. He watched me with a new wariness, as if trying to map the person I was becoming onto the one he thought he knew. The distance between those versions was no longer subtle. One evening he asked if I was happy. The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it was late. I considered it carefully before answering. "I'm aligned," I said. He frowned, uncertain how to interpret that. I realized then that happiness had never been the measure he used. Control had been, predictability, familiar roles. Alignment didn't fit into that framework. As I prepared for what came next, I understood that this chapter wasn't about success alone. It was about boundaries, about the courage to choose without consensus. The offer had changed the stakes, not because of what it promised, but because of what it required. I was no longer negotiating my place in my own life. And whether he adapted or resisted, That truth would stand, firm and undeniable, in the space between us. The first time I saw my work displayed under proper lighting, I had to stop myself from looking away. It stood there with a confidence I hadn't known how to give it before, framed by white space and deliberate distance, no longer competing for attention or apologizing for its presence. People approached it slowly, the way they do when they sense something requires patience. I stayed back at first, letting the room move without me. I watched how strangers tilted their heads, how long they lingered, where their eyes traced the lines I had carved alone at my table months earlier. No one laughed. No one rushed past. The piece didn't need defending. It held its own. Someone asked who the artist was, and the gallery representative said my name easily, as if it belonged there. Hearing it spoken that way made my chest tighten. Not with pride exactly, but with recognition. This was what it felt like to be introduced without a qualifier, without being softened or minimized. The opening wasn't large or loud. It didn't need to be. Conversation stayed low, thoughtful. People asked questions that went deeper than surface impressions. They wanted to know why I'd chosen certain forms, what I'd been thinking about while working, how long I'd been developing my approach. Each question felt like an invitation rather than a test. I answered honestly, without rehearsing or shrinking. The words came more easily now, grounded in the knowledge that I didn't have to persuade anyone to take me seriously. They already were. I noticed the absence before I noticed anything else. He wasn't there. I hadn't invited him, and he hadn't asked. The realization didn't sting the way I thought it might have. Instead, it clarified something I had been circling for weeks. This part of my life had grown beyond the need for his presence. Later, as the evening settled, I stepped aside to check my phone. Messages waited, one from the gallery confirming interest from a buyer, another from a friend who'd heard about the show, and then one from him. "Where are you?" it read. I stared at the screen, considering the weight of that question. Not where am I doing, or how did it go? Just where. Location without curiosity. I didn't answer right away. I slid the phone back into my bag and returned to the room. When I did respond later, I kept it simple. "At the gallery." His reply came quickly. "You didn't tell me." I didn't feel defensive. I didn't feel guilty. I felt finished with explaining. I put the phone away and focused on the conversation in front of me, on the person asking about future pieces, about timelines, about what I wanted next. By the time I left, the night air felt different, lighter. I walked to my car with a calm certainty that surprised me. The city around me buzzed with its usual indifference, and for once, that felt comforting. My life no longer hinged on one person's understanding. At home, he was waiting. Not angry, not loud, just alert. He asked about the gallery, about who was there, about why he hadn't been included. The questions came in quick succession, carrying an edge I recognized well. I answered what mattered and ignored what didn't. I told him it went well. I told him there was interest. I didn't offer details unless he asked directly, and even then, I kept my responses measured. "You could have told me," he said again, frustration seeping through. I looked at him and realized how tired I was of that sentence. How often it had been used to shift responsibility back onto me, to suggest that his lack of engagement was my failure to communicate. "I didn't need to," I said, my voice steady. The silence that followed was heavier than before. He paced, stopped, started again. He talked about how things were changing too fast, about how he felt left out. The word "left out" echoed in my mind, hollow and misplaced. "You threw it away," I said quietly. He stopped moving. "What?" "The gift," I continued. "You didn't ask about it. You didn't look at it. You decided what it was without knowing." His mouth opened, then closed. He searched for a response that would reframe the moment, soften it, make it less consequential. I saw the effort and felt nothing. "This isn't about that," he said finally. I nodded. "You're right, it's about everything else." The truth settled between us, unarguable and complete. My success hadn't created this divide. It had revealed it. It showed us, clearly, what had always been there. I went to bed that night without waiting for the conversation to resolve. There was nothing left to negotiate. As I lay in the dark, I felt a sense of finality that wasn't sad or dramatic. It was clean. For the first time, my work stood in the world on its own terms. And for the first time, so did I. The paperwork arrived in a neat digital folder, organized and unmistakably real. I opened it early in the morning, before the house fully woke up, and read every line with the same care I used when I worked alone at my table. Dates, terms, conditions, nothing flashy, nothing vague, just clarity. I didn't feel the rush people talk about. There was no sudden surge of triumph, no urge to call anyone and announce the moment. What I felt was steadiness. The kind that comes when something aligns so cleanly it doesn't need celebration to prove itself. When the gallery called later to walk me through the final details, I listened more than I spoke. I asked precise questions, not because I doubted them, but because I respected the process. Timing mattered. Representation mattered. What happened next mattered. I understood now that being taken seriously required taking myself seriously first. We discussed the buyer, carefully, without gossip or speculation. The offer was solid, the intent was clear. I took notes, thanked them, and asked for a data review. Not because I needed it, but because I had earned the right to take it. After the call ended, I closed my laptop and sat there, hands folded, listening to the quiet hum of the house. He was still asleep. The morning light filtered in softly, indifferent to what had just been set in motion. I thought about how many decisions I had rushed in the past, afraid that hesitation would be mistaken for weakness. This time, patience felt like authority. I signed the agreement that afternoon. The act itself was simple. My name typed into a designated space, a confirmation email sent and received. No witnesses, no applause. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled, not because I was relieved, but because something had finally concluded. Months of work, weeks of conversations, years of being underestimated, all of it crystallized into a single quiet decision. The news traveled faster than I expected. I didn't announce it, but somehow it reached the edges of his world anyway. A comment from a mutual acquaintance, a mention overheard in a conversation he thought I wasn't listening to. He came home that evening carrying a different energy, distracted, unsettled. "So," he said, trying to sound casual, "I heard your thing sold." I looked up from what I was doing and met his eyes. "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if testing the word. "That's good," he added, the pause doing more work than the compliment. "You didn't say anything." "I didn't need to," I replied. The silence that followed wasn't hostile, it was unfamiliar. He searched for something else to say, a way back into control, and came up empty. I watched him recalibrate in real time, and for the first time, I didn't step in to smooth it over. Later, alone, I reflected on how different this moment felt from what I'd once imagined. I had thought success would feel loud, vindicating, like proof delivered to the right audience. Instead, it felt contained, inward. The sale didn't change who I was. It confirmed what I had been carrying quietly all along. Ownership changes things. Not just legally, but psychologically. It reframes the past without rewriting it. I didn't need to revisit old arguments or point out missed chances. The facts stood on their own now. What had been dismissed was no longer available for dismissal. Over the next few days, practicalities followed. Transfers, scheduling, discussions about future work. Each interaction was professional, respectful, efficient. No one asked me to justify myself. No one treated my time as expendable. The contrast was sharp enough to be almost uncomfortable. At home, the distance widened. He asked questions with a new edge, not curiosity but anxiety. How much did it sell for? What did it mean long-term? Where was this headed? I answered selectively, calmly. The information I shared no longer felt like currency I had to trade for peace. One evening he asked, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I considered the question, not defensively but honestly. "Because you weren't listening then," I said, and I wasn't interested in explaining it again. He looked at me as if seeing me for the first time, and maybe he was. The version of me who waited for permission, who softened every statement, who folded herself into his expectations, was no longer present. The sale had done more than validate my work. It had shifted the balance of my life. Not by granting me something new, but by removing what I no longer needed: approval, explanation, negotiation. That night, as I prepared for bed, I understood that this chapter wasn't about money or recognition. It was about finality, about closing a door without slamming it, about choosing what moved forward with me and what stayed behind. As I turned off the light, I felt calm, certain, and finished with waiting. The sale wasn't the climax I had once imagined. It was the conclusion of something long overdue, and the beginning of a life I was finally prepared to claim on my own terms. I woke before the alarm, the house still dim and undecided, the kind of quiet that used to make me anxious. That morning, it didn't. It felt settled, as if the decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. I lay there for a moment, listening to his breathing, steady and untroubled, and knew I wasn't waiting for the right time anymore. I moved through the house slowly, choosing what to take with the same care I used in my work. Clothes I wore because I liked them, not because they blended in. Books with margins marked in my handwriting. Tools that fit my hands the way they always had. I left behind things I had kept to make the space feel shared. Objects that belonged more to the idea of us than to me. This wasn't loss. It was sorting. The suitcase didn't look dramatic when it was full. It looked practical, manageable. I zipped it closed and felt no urge to add anything else. The clarity surprised me. I had imagined this moment as heavier, filled with second-guessing. Instead, it felt precise, like finishing a piece and knowing exactly when to stop. He was awake by the time I carried the suitcase into the living room, sitting on the couch, phone in hand, the television muted. He looked up, eyes flicking from the bag to my face, confusion settling in slowly. "What's this?" he asked. "I'm leaving," I said. The words landed cleanly. No preamble, no explanation. I had rehearsed them in my head the night before, but they didn't need embellishment. They were complete on their own. He stood, the movement abrupt. "Leaving where?" "For now," I said. It was the truth, and it was enough. He searched my face for something familiar, some sign that this was a negotiation. When he didn't find it, his tone shifted. Softer, reasonable. He talked about timing, about how things had been intense lately, about how we should talk this through properly. He said we didn't have to make decisions like this in the morning. I listened without interrupting, noticing how carefully he avoided naming what had actually happened between us, how he framed this as sudden, emotional, unnecessary, as if the last years could be reduced to a mood. "I've thought about it," I said when he paused. "For a long time." He shook his head. "You didn't say anything." "I know." That was the part he didn't understand. Silence hadn't meant confusion. It had meant clarity forming quietly, without his influence. I hadn't needed to announce it for it to be real. He tried again, this time with frustration creeping in. He asked if this was about the gallery, about the sale, about me thinking I was suddenly above him. The words were sharp enough to reveal the fear underneath them. I felt no satisfaction in that realization, only confirmation. "It's not about being above you," I said. "It's about not being beneath myself anymore." The room went still. I could see him reaching for something to counter that, some argument or accusation that would restore balance. None came. There was nothing to debate without admitting the truth of it. I picked up my keys and felt their weight settle into my palm. The small, ordinary object felt significant in a way it never had before. This wasn't an escape, it was an exit. He asked where I would go. I gave him the name of a place, temporary and neutral. He frowned, as if trying to map my future back onto his expectations and failing. "You're making a mistake," he said quietly. I met his eyes and saw certainty there, but not about me, about himself. About the belief that I would eventually come back, that this was a phase, That time would soften my resolve the way it always had before. I don't think so, I replied. I didn't hug him. I didn't reach out. There was nothing unfinished between us that required touch. I walked to the door, set my suitcase down long enough to put on my shoes, and stood there for a moment, hand on the handle. For years, I had looked back at this house whenever I left, mentally checking if I'd forgotten something, if I needed to adjust myself to fit better when I returned. That impulse was gone now. I knew exactly what I was taking with me, and exactly what I was leaving behind. When I opened the door, the morning air rushed in, cool and grounding. I lifted the suitcase and stepped outside without turning around. The door closed behind me with a sound that felt final without being cruel. In the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, letting the reality of it settle. My hands were steady on the wheel. My breath was even. There was no surge of relief, no spike of fear. Just alignment, quiet and unmistakable. As I pulled away from the curb, I understood that walking away without a scene was the most honest ending I could give us. There was no victory in it, no punishment, just the acceptance that some things don't need to be repaired to be complete. The road ahead stretched open, unremarkable and full of possibility. I drove toward it without looking back, carrying only what I had reclaimed, and knowing that whatever came next would be shaped by my own choosing, not by what someone else had decided I was worth. The first morning in my new place was quieter than I expected. Not the heavy silence of something missing, but the gentle kind that lets you hear yourself think. Light filtered through unfamiliar curtains, settling across the floor in a way that felt temporary and honest. I sat at the small table with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, and realized I wasn't bracing for anything. There was no next conversation to rehearse, no reaction to anticipate. For the first time in years, the day belonged entirely to me. I thought about the anniversary night again, the way the box had left his hand so easily, how small the sound was when it hit the table leg. Back then, I'd believed that moment was about a gift being rejected. Now I understood it had been about something else entirely. It wasn't the object he dismissed. It was the time, the patience, the care behind it. It was the part of me that worked quietly without asking to be seen. He hadn't thrown away something cheap or insignificant. He had thrown away the chance to know me fully. That realization didn't make me angry. Anger would have kept him at the center of the story. Instead, it brought a strange clarity. Some people only recognize value when it's labeled, priced, and approved by someone else. Others never learn how to see it at all. Neither of those truths had anything to do with my worth. In the days that followed, my life settled into a different rhythm. Conversations were direct. Decisions were made without negotiation. When I worked with focus instead of apology. When I rested without guilt. No one questioned whether what I did mattered. No one laughed it off as a phase. The difference wasn't just external, it was internal. A quiet shift in how I measured myself. I stopped using other people's reactions as evidence. I stopped waiting for recognition to make something real. The work had always been real. I just hadn't always allowed myself to stand behind it without flinching. I realized then that being unseen for so long had taught me something essential. It taught me how to see myself without mirrors. It taught me how to trust my own judgment when no one else was watching. That kind of knowing doesn't disappear once it's found. It stays with you, steady and unshakable. What surprised me most was how little I needed closure from him. There was no final speech, no moment where everything was explained and understood. The ending didn't require agreement to be complete. Sometimes the most honest resolution is simply leaving with your dignity intact. The object he threw away still exists. It stands now as proof, not of revenge or triumph, but of continuity. Of effort that didn't vanish just because someone refused to look at it. I carried more than a piece of work out of that marriage. I carried my self-respect, my clarity, and the quiet confidence that comes from choosing yourself without needing permission. If you're listening to this and something about it feels familiar, you're not alone. Many of us have had our work, our voices, our efforts reduced to something small because it made someone else more comfortable that way. Being dismissed doesn't mean you lack value. It often means you were never meant to stay where you were shrinking. Walking away isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's calm, sometimes it's done without witnesses, and sometimes it's the most powerful decision you'll ever make. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever had something important to you dismissed or overlooked? How did you handle it? Or what are you still learning from it? Feel free to share in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, stories about quiet strength, self-respect, and reclaiming what others failed to see, consider staying with the channel. There are many more stories ahead, each one exploring what happens when people stop accepting the roles they were given and start choosing themselves instead. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for being part of this space. Sometimes the most meaningful journeys don't begin with a victory. They begin the moment we stop explaining our worth and start living it. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.